Today's daf we're going to be learning a Shevuot daf Yud Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by the Pittsburgh Daf Yomi group for a full shlema for Rabbi Amy Bardak, a Rabbi Huva Bat Liba, who is having surgery today. Wishing our organizer and leader a speedy recovery. Okay, we're going to get started with a quick review of the end of yesterday's daf. We started with this din of Rabbi Yochanan that was quoted by Ula, and this is going to be our topic for today, which again, we had no idea yet how it's connected. Only at the very end of today's daf are we going to see the connection to our sugya. So we start with this halacha, which Ula says, and there's a study guide for today, which will help kind of organize. It's a lot of back and forth, kind of where we're up to. Ula said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, "Tmidim shelo hitzrachu litzibur nifdim tmimim." Remember the way we described this. We take the money that was collected from the machatzira shekel, from the half shekel that everybody paid. They took the money and they would buy animals for the year. Okay, like when you buy something in advance, you never know exactly how many you're going to need. Often they would be left with leftovers. So what do you do with those leftover animals that you didn't use this year? The obvious would be just use them next year, but we said you can't do that because you have to buy them with this year's funds. So you can't use ones from last year's funds for this year's sacrifices. And again, these are we're talking about for all the public offerings. So if you're left with a bunch of animals that they don't need anymore, what do? You redeem them when they're unblemished. And then you kind of buy them back, right? So first you sell them, then the sanctity goes on to the coins. And then you take those coins and they're what you do with whatever you do with leftover money from the previous year. And then you take money from the new funds and you buy them back and you use them. To which we said, Rav Chisda, okay, so what happened was Rabbi Yochanan said that. We'll get the character straight. Raba came and said, taught this halacha that Rabbi Yochanan said. And Rav Chisda said, what on earth are you talking about? We know that you can't redeem animals that were sanctified. Kedushat haguf, right? Animals in general have sanctity where you say this animal's for a sacrifice. It's got sanctity, inherent sanctity. You can't just redeem that kind of animal. Right? Sometimes the animal has to be left to die. Sometimes we leave it to graze till it gets a blemish, and then you redeem it with the blemish, and then you use the money for a sacrifice. But you can't just redeem it while it's in perfect condition. To which Raba says, "What do you mean you can't? I'll give you another example." Now he doesn't really answer the question, and that's why after we get back into this long-winded argument between him and Rav Chisda about is the Ketoret, Kedushat haguf, Kedushat damim, we'll see all that. But we're going to get back to the question, even if we accept what Raba says, that Ketoret is Kadosh, Kedushat haguf, inherent sanctity, and yet it can be redeemed, still the question is, how? How does that work? Okay, so we'll get back to that later. Right now, Raba's proof that we saw at the end of yesterday's daf was this thing that they do with the Motar Ketoret. Now notice they're very similar. One is leftover animals, one is leftover incense. So the leftover incense, again, what would they do? They would prepare the incense at the beginning of the year, presumably, and then they would use that incense throughout the year. And presumably there might be some left over. It's very hard to calculate exactly how much. And again, you can't use the incense from the previous year. So they came up with this whole thing about paying the people who made the incense and then redeeming it and all that. But it's clearly that you can redeem this. So now the Gemara is Rav Chisda is going to answer, right? Ketoret kamarta, and that's where we ended at the very end of Yud Amud Bet, beginning of Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph. You're talking about Ketoret, Shana Ketoret, the Kedushat damim. Ketoret does not have inherent sanctity. Ketoret is Kedushat damim. Just its value is sanctified. Now, what are we talking about here? So Rashi tells us that why does Raba think that it's Kedushat haguf? So Rashi says, Desal kadate shamachteshet kli sharetu. This is Rashi. Rabbi Yochanan and Tosfot go in that way, a different direction, but we'll stick with Rashi. Rashi claims, now how do you prepare the ketoret? You take herb, right? Different herbs like leaves, things like that. This whole Pitum read some people every day, some people on Shabbat. Either which way, what do? We crush them all up, okay? We grind them. So we grind them in a grinder. That grinder, what Raba claims, is a kli sharet. Now, how does something have inherent sanctity? There's two ways. Either you say, this animal is going to be on the altar, and you designate it, okay? Animal doesn't go in a kli sharet, so an animal is by designating it. You designate it for your sacrifice, that's already Kedushat, inherent sanctity. With something else like Ketoret, is by putting it in a vessel, or a mincha offering, which we're going to talk about today, the meal offering. So you're preparing this dough. The dough isn't sanctified, but when you put it in the vessel, the holy vessel, it goes into this bowl. When it's in the bowl, it becomes sanctified, inherent sanctity. So they claim now that Torah is put into two different things. First, it's ground up, and that's way back, right? Beginning of the year when they prepare it all. Then there's a later stage, which is when you take the incense that you're about to burn on the altar, then you put it in a different vessel. And that for sure, everybody agrees, once it goes in that vessel, it has inherent sanctity. But we're talking about in an earlier stage. So according to Rashi, it's the fact that does this grinder, the mortar, does it have inherent sanctity or not? In other words, is it a kli sharet? And therefore, would then the Ktoret have inherent sanctity? So basically, Raba says, my proof is the Ktoret has inherent sanctity. Rav Chisda says, Ktoret doesn't have inherent sanctity at that stage. Only once, you're about to bring it on the altar, but that's not what we're talking about. Because once you're going to bring it on the altar, it's not going to be left over. We're looking for leftover that was left over from the beginning of the year. So that's the machloka between them. So now the question, right? Raba is going to try to prove, how can I prove to you that it's kedushat haguf and not kedushat hamim? So Raba says, Elameata, we're going to have a big back and forth between Raba and Rav Chisda. Elameata, if you think it's kedushat hamim, lo tipasil b'tful yom. Well, then it shouldn't become pasul if a tful yom touches it. We have to learn a lot of things today, a lot of terms. What's a tful yom? It's someone who's impure, goes to the mikveh in the morning of the day they're supposed to become pure, and they've already gone to the mikveh. But you're not completely pure by just going to the mikveh. It kind of removes a certain level of impurity, but you have to wait till sunset to be able to, for example, eat truma or kodshim, okay, sacrificial items. So now a tamei person touches something, they make it impure. But there's also another term you need to know, which is tipasel versus titamei. If you make something tamei, that means that tamei item, okay, you made it impure, that can pass on impurity to something else. If I touch food, that food could touch another food and make it impure. Like let's say it touches truma. Right? Let's say I'm a rishon, I touch food, which makes it a sheni, which anything can turn into a sheni. That sheni can turn, if it touches, that food touches truma, it can make it a shlishi. And if that truma food touches kodshim, it can make it a revi, because in sacrificial items, the truma goes even farther. That's if I can be mitame something. Now, a tful yom can be mitame something, meaning if a tful yom touches food and that food touches truma, it doesn't make the truma impure. Just the food I touch will become impure. But, and the truth is, it's a little tricky. It's really, the word tipasel is actually not talking about regular food, regular chulim food. Tipasel means that I can pass on impurity to this item, but it disqualifies it. That means that's the end game. It can't pass on impurity to something else. If I say mitameh, it'll make that tameh, which will make something else, could theoretically make something else tameh. But if I say tipasel, it means that's the end game, and tipasel is only relevant for truma or kodshim. So if a tful yom touches chulin, nothing happens to it. If a tful yom touches kodshim or truma, it disqualifies that, okay? But that item won't be able to pass on impurity to anything else. Okay, these are all just details that aren't so critical for our purposes, but it's saying here, a tvul yom can only be posel, okay, something that has kedushat haguf, okay, like truma and kodshim, which are inherently sanctified. And therefore, if you're going to say it's only kedushat damim, this ktoret, the me'ata loti pasel b'tvul yom. If it doesn't have kedushat damim, then it can't be disqualified by tvul yom, because only truma and kodshim and things like that can be, they have inherent sanctity. And okay, so what? Well, Allah Matanya, look at the Braita. Why does it say in the Braita? Nitana b'machteshet nifselet b'tful yom. Once it goes into the mortar, it's already disqualified by a tful yom, which means that it obviously has inherent sanctity. Okay, now here comes Rav Chisda's possible retort, which is going to be rejected because it says v'chi tema. Now, if you want to answer, and Rav Chisda, you want to say, maybe you could say that a tful yom disqualifies even things that have just their value as sanctified, which that's what Rav Chisda claims the Ktoret is. The Hatnan, look at this Mishnah. The Mishnah says, the mincha offerings, as soon as you designate them, okay, I say this is going to be used for a mincha offering, immediately, that's mehukdeshu, it has the laws of me'ilah. Me'ilah is misuse of consecrated property. It's already consecrated for the purposes of me'ilah, but anything that's kedushat damim, kedushat haguf, anything like that has me'ilah. However, katshuba kli, once the mincha offering goes into the vessel, as I told you, we're going to talk about this, it now is potentially available to become disqualified if a tful yom touches it. If a mechusar kippurim touches it, another term we need to know, which is a person, there's, let's say, a leper, goes through a 7-day tara process, purifying. Then on day 7, they go to the mikvah. At night, they become pure. However, they still have to bring a korban the next day. And until they bring that korban, they're called mechusar kippurim, and they also can pass on impure. They can also disqualify sanctified items. And lina, if you leave a sanctified item that has inherent kedusha, these are all things that are only, okay, notice, they're only ones kitshuba kli, which means only at that later stage when they have inherent sanctity, do they have the following criteria, right? That the following things happen. A tful yom, mechusar kippurim can disqualify them, and they're disqualified by leaving them overnight. Like, for example, right, anything you have in the temple you're supposed to use that day, like the blood, disqualified by leaving it overnight. The, what else, right? A mincha, you make a mincha offering. If you don't offer it that day, you leave it for the next day, disqualified. So all those things are disqualified at night. That's only though once it was in the vessel. If I didn't put it in the vessel yet, I could leave it till the next day. Okay, that's all, right? Kedusha damim doesn't have a problem with lina. Lina literally means sleeping overnight, right? Obviously, mincha is not sleeping, and it means leaving it overnight. So what do you see here? Kachubakli in lo, kachubakli lo. So again, you can't say, this was all to say, if you want to try to claim that Raba tried to say, I'm going to prove that Ktoret, that's what he keeps trying to prove, is Kedushat Haguf. And if I could prove it's Kedushat Haguf, I can use that as a proof. Oh, look, here's a precedent for Kedushat Haguf being able to be redeemed in the Motar Torah, like the Tzmidi. Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Chisda keeps saying, no, it's Kedushat Damim. Now, Raba just said, I know it's Kedushat Haguf because look, once you put it in the Machteshet, it's Nifsela B'Tvul Yom. Hasn't yet gone into the later Kli Sharet. It's already got inherent sanctity just by going into the mortar. And if you want to say, oh, it doesn't bother me, Tvul Yom can disqualify even if it's just Kedushat Damim, and that's what Rav Chisda wants to prove. Here we have a Braita that makes it, Mishnah that makes it very clear that only once it's in the sanctified kli and becomes inherently sanctified, only then is Tvul Yom an issue, therefore proving that Ktoret, right, is, since it's Hana b'Machteshet Nifsela B'Tvul Yom, it must be inherent sanctity. So now, the Gemara is Rav Chisda is gonna counter with another question. Elamai, Kedushat Hagufi. Okay, so I get what you're saying, Rabba. You seem to be proving your point. So now you're gonna say, really, it's Kedushat Haguf. I got another problem with it. Elameata tipasel belina. Okay, what did we just say? The Ktoret, he's got a really good question here. Ktoret, anything that's Kedushat Haguf, we just said, is disqualified by its full yom, right? And also disqualified by leaving it overnight. Okay, let's think about Ktoret. You make it in the beginning of the year. You crush it up in this mortar. At that point, according to Raba, it's got inherent sanctity. Okay, well, now you got a big problem, Raba, because if it has inherent sanctity, then how can you use it throughout the year? It should be disqualified as soon as that first night comes, because anything that has inherent sanctity is immediately disqualified if you leave it to the next day. And alamatnam, why does it say in the Mishnah, hakometz v'halavona v'aktoret u'minchat kohanim u'minchat kohen mashuach u'minchat nisachim mo'alim b'hem mishu k'tishu k'tshu b'kli u'chsharu li pasel b'tvuyom u'chsar kippurim u'belina k'tshu b'kli im lo k'tshu b'kli lo. Okay, this is basically just proving. I'll go through all the cases. Kometz is when you take, the kohen puts 3 fingers into the mincha dough and picks out a little piece of it. That's the kometz, which is then sanctified. The lavona, which is the frankincense, which is often brought with a mincha offering. The ktoret, which is our topic. The minchat kohanim, the mincha offering of a kohen, or the minchat kohen mashuach, or the minchat nisachim. Okay, that's the one that goes with all the korbanot. Mo'alim mishuk teshu. Once they're sanctified, again, just the value of them is sanctified. There's already the laws of me'ilah. Once they went into the vessel, okay, you put them in the sanctified vessel, which means what? The Ktoret before it gets offered on the altar, right? Not the Ktoret at the beginning of the year. And they're immediate. How do I know it's not the beginning of the year? Because look what it says. Huchsharuli pasel b'tful yom, right? The tful yom can disqualify it. The mechusar kippurim can disqualify it, and it's disqualified by leaving it overnight. So, this is only once it goes into the vessel in the temple before it's offered up on the altar. So that seems to prove Rav Chisda's point very clearly. Amar lei, but Raba has an answer. Lina kamarta, shanik torah to'il v'tzurata b'kol hashana kula. This has two different interpretations. I think they're both interesting. He says the first interpretation, so let's go with it. Torah is different because it retains its form all year long. That means, what's this psul of lina? The psul of lina is, if you take our examples from before, you leave over the blood, or you leave over I don't know if this is actually true about blood, but if you leave over the meal offering, so what happens to it? It gets worse the next day, right? All these things over time, I guess blood could dry out, right? But over time, they get worse. Okay? Even if the next day they don't look much worse, but over time, they're going to get worse. And the disqualification, this actually helps us understand better, the disqualification of lina is because it deteriorates. But the ketoret doesn't deteriorate over time, really, like not much anyway. And therefore, there's no disqualification of lina. Now, it does say it in the Mishnah here, but you could say the lina is referring to everything else. But the ketoret doesn't really get worse. You could think, that's what I was thinking about, Miriam, that the strength of the smell subsides, right? Over time, it won't smell as strong. But for the most part, it's a much longer, like I'm thinking of dried spices you have in your house. They have a much longer shelf life. Certainly one night doesn't make much of a difference at all. So I think that's how to understand it. So therefore, because it doesn't deteriorate really much at all, the disqualification of lina is not relevant for ketoret. And that's why you can make the ketoret in the beginning of the year and it's not disqualified lina, even though all these other things would be. Okay, so now Raba basically is proving that the ketoret could be inherent sanctity, and yet you can redeem it. And that's his point. I just want to give you the second interpretation of because it's not exactly clear what it says, right? Its form is all year long. So we kind of explain that as it doesn't deteriorate. But another answer is there would be no way. In other words, we know the ketoret was done not on a daily basis. So assuming that we hold like Raba, that putting it in the mortar already makes it sanctified, inherent sanctity, you'd never be able to make Torah in advance. You'd have to make it every single day. And we know that's not the case. So that proves that it must not be disqualified by lina. It must be an exception to the rule because we have to create it early on, and have it around. And then I guess they don't want to be doing it every day fresh. So because it is that way, that kind of proves that there's no psul lina. Otherwise, we would never be able to do this at all. Okay, either which way, Raba has proved, at least somewhat, that he responded to all of Rav Chisda's retorts about the ketoret, and there's Raba's proof. Look, ketoret is inherent sanctity, and yet can be redeemed. There's a paradigm. However, the Gemara continues, and I told you we get back to this, mikom makom kashya. It's still difficult, because okay, now we have two questions, one on ketoret, one on the tzmidin. So inherent kedusha is not redeemed. We know that from lots of places. You don't just redeem it like that. Something has to get ruined before you can actually redeem it, right? Like a blemish or something like that. So how can you just remove the kedusha? That's why it's called inherent sanctity. Inherent sanctity can't just be redeemed. Okay, so now we have to have an answer for that. Raba pulls out an answer. Amar Raba, leiv beiti matnei alehem. Okay, so the first part of the sugya, I just want to be clear in terms of where we're going. First part of the sugya was Raba's answer to Rav Chisda about the ketoret. And then we had this whole diyun about the ketoret. Can you prove really it's kedushat haguf? Maybe it's really kedushat damim, which is what Rav Chisda kept trying to say. And Raba's proved his point. But just because we have that doesn't help. The second part is going to be talking about this answer of Raba. What is leiv beiti matnei alehem? The court makes a condition. At the beginning of the year, when they stand and they buy all their animals and they crush all the incense, they say, im hutzrichu. If we need it, then great, we'll use it. Im lav, and if not, we'll use it for its value. It'll be just sanctified. Its value will be sanctified, but not inherent sanctification. If I take an animal for a sacrifice, I designate that animal, it's for the sacrifice. I can't say, can't start stipulating if this, if that. No, I need the korban, right? I'm taking the animal, it's sanctified immediately. But if I'm buying at the beginning of the year for the public, all these animals, I can say, right? Whatever's left over, right, will be left over. Okay, so that's a stipulation the court can make. So is it really true the court can make that kind of stipulation? Okay, who said? A little bit strange. Amar le Abaye. Abaye starts disagreeing now. Hamar, Huda Amar, isn't Mar the one who, aren't you the one who said, basically he's questioning Raba from quoting Raba himself. Aren't you the one who says, Hikdish Zachar Ledamav, Kadosh Kedushat Haguf? If you take an animal and say, I'm going to use this animal for its value is sanctified, which means theoretically I could take that animal, sell it, take the money, and buy a sacrifice for it. So if I say I'm doing that, that doesn't work. Kadosh Kedushat Haguf. I can't do that with an animal. If I say I'm taking this couch and the value of this couch is going to the temple for sacrifices, then I sell the couch and I take the money, I bring it to the temple. But if I say that about an animal, since the animal could go on the altar, I can't do that. Okay, I have to basically take that out. That animal has inherent sanctity and it has to go on the altar. I can't redeem it. So how can I possibly take animals at the beginning of the year? If you yourself said this, Raba, how could you possibly take animals that have inherent sanctity and say that they're going for the temple, right? And even say you're bringing them for sacrifices and then redeem them? You yourself said, even if I say I'm only making them kedushat damim, they're not. So basically, you want to say the court says either the animals will be kedushat haguf, or if they're left over, they'll be kedushat damim. But you said yourself, if you make them kedushat damim, they're actually sanctified kedushat haguf. There's no such thing. So he says, "Lo kasha hada amar lidmei olah, hada amar lidmei netzachim." Rabbi answers and says, no. If I say I want the value of these animals to go to sacrifices, then of course that animal has to be brought as a sacrifice. That's what I was talking about. But if you say I want this animal the value of this animal to be for libations, well, libations are with wine and oil libations. You can't use animals for libations. So if I say I want the value of this animal to go to libations, then I can actually redeem it. So therefore, when the rabbis got up at the beginning of the year and they stipulate, if we need them, they'll be inherent sanctity. If not, they'll go to nisachim, or they'll be used for other things that animals can't be used for, and then you actually can do it. So that question he deals with. But Abaye brings another question. Etibe Abaye, par v'seir shel Yom Kippurim she'avdu, v'ifrish acherim tachtehem. You take the par and the seir of Yom Kippur, right, which we've talked about, and they get lost. So you designate the animals get lost. This is the classic case of, not being able to redeem animals. Okay, the animal gets lost, you bring a different one in instead, and now you find the original animal. So, and turning now to Amabet, okay, and these, the ones for people who made a mistake with Avodah Zarah, they worshiped Avodah Zarah, the community worshiped Avodah Zarah. These are communal sacrifices. Sha'avdu, they got lost. Bifrish achirim tachtehem. And again, you designated other ones instead of them. So now when you find the original ones, you can't use them anymore. The sacrifice has been done. So what do? Well, kulam yamutu, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says they have to be left to die. This is the deen of a chatat. Chatat is very severe. If you designate an animal for a sin offering and something happens, and here we're talking about communal sin offerings, basically, they have to be left to die. You can do nothing with them. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon omrim yiru ad sheyista'avu v'yimachu v'yipalu d'meim l'nidava. Okay, different opinion. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon say you leave them to graze until they get a blemish, and then you can redeem them, and then you can use the money for voluntary offerings. Why is this? Even though chatat generally is left to die, sin offerings. Well, ein chatat tzibor meta. The general chatat that die, we have a machloket now about the communal ones. Individual ones, there's a whole bunch of cases like if I use it and my animal gets lost and then I find, right, and then I use a different one, I have to bring a sin offering, and then I find the old one, then for sure it dies, okay? And there's a bunch of different cases where the animal dies. But there's a machloket here, does that apply for communal offerings or not? Okay, the fact that there's a machloket is not really relevant to us. Notice, nobody thinks they could just be redeemed unblemished. Why not? If Rabba's right that leiv beitim maneh alehim, on what? Leiv beitim maneh alehim is on all the animals that were purchased for communal offerings, including these animals. So amai, lema leiv beitim maneh alehim. Why don't you say here, this is part of the communal offerings. In the beginning of the year, they bought all these animals for communal offerings. Then they stipulated, If we don't need them, right, then we can use them for anything else, right? We can redeem them and just their value will be sanctified. So why don't we say these animals don't have inherent sanctity and we can just redeem them? Why do they have to be left to die or to graze till they get blemished? To which the Gemara answers, Avudim ka'amart, shane avudim de lo shchichi. You're giving an example of lost animals. When the Beit Din made this stipulation at the beginning of the year, why did they do it? Okay, I'm doing a kiddush the Shabbos, so I'm buying all this food, and I'm like, okay, I'll buy extra. Whatever will be left for the shul, right? You know in advance that you're buying extra, and that whatever's left extra will just be used in the future. So that's very typical. But the fact that I designate an animal and the animal gets lost is pretty atypical. The animals that we use I mean, on the one hand, animals run away. On the other hand, they were in a space and they were probably protected and watched. And it wasn't so common that these animals get lost. So when the Beit Din makes stipulations, they make stipulations for common things. They don't make stipulations for uncommon occurrences. And therefore, the stipulation doesn't apply for a case where they got lost, because that's not what the stipulation was made for. Stipulation was made for all the extra that are left over. So that's the case. Shane abudim de lo shchich. Okay, lost items are not common. Is that really true? That lost items, because they're uncommon, I didn't say it right. Obviously, their lost items are uncommon, but because they're uncommon, the stipulation didn't apply to them. Let's check out that principle. Hare para de lo shchicha. Okay, para aduma is pretty uncommon. Okay, I read in the Shansin, it said there's 7 times it happened in Bayit Sheni that they had a para aduma, something like that. So it's a very uncommon occurrence that you have a para aduma. And basically, we're going to see that there's a case where le beitim matneh lehem on the para aduma, even though it's uncommon, and then we're going to question that whole theory, okay, about le beitim matneh only on common things and not on cases where it's uncommon. Vitanya, it says in a Braita, para nifdet al kol psul sheba. You can redeem a para aduma on any disqualification it has. Meta tipadeh, if it dies before you get to slaughter it, you can redeem it. Nishchita, if you slaughter it in the wrong place, okay, that's a specific place on the Mount of Olives where you're supposed to slaughter it, tipadeh, you can redeem it. Matzah acheret na'ehimena, even if you just find a nicer para aduma, tipadeh, you just redeem it. Okay? Shchata al gabei marachta, once it's slaughtered in its location, ein la p'diah olamit, then you can no longer redeem it. So what do we see here? Para aduma is lo shchicha, and yet it can be redeemed if it's not needed. What do you see? Sounds like even in uncommon cases, right? Forget about para aduma in general is uncommon, but then it's going to be uncommon that it died before you slaughter it, that you slaughter it at the wrong place, right? All these, you'll find a nicer one. This is all very uncommon, and yet we allow you to redeem it. So the first answer is Shani para de koche bedakabayiti. Who said para aduma is inherent sanctity? This principle applies to inherent sanctity that we're talking about. Who says a para aduma is inherent sanctity? Remember, the para aduma doesn't get offered on the altar, right? Normally, that's something that has inherent sanctity. So they say, wait, if it doesn't have inherent sanctity, ihachi meta onishchita tipadeh. Well, if you're going to say it doesn't have inherent sanctity, then how could, if it died or it got slaughtered, tipadeh? Ha be'inan ha'amada v'haracha. You need to stand up the animal in order to evaluate it. So now we have a problem because the animal, if it's dead or slaughtered, the animal can't stand up. And this is based on a pasuk that talks about if you have an animal and you want to redeem it, you stand it up to get valued, and the Kohen evaluates, gives an assessment about what its value is. And it has to be able to stand up. So, because the Psukim talk about it, Behenmid, Lifnei Kohen, you stand it up. But this para aduma, how could it be redeemed at all? Because it can't stand up. So they say, oh, don't worry about that. Hamani Rabbi Shimon, that's all Rabbi Shimon. That Da'amar, Koche Mizbeach Hayu Bechlal Hamada Baracha, Koche Bedakabayit Lo Hayu Bechlal Hamada Baracha. This must be Rabbi Shimon's unique opinion, it's Braita, because Rabbi Shimon says if it's only if it's inherent sanctity does it need, right? Which the case was talking about an animal, usually the animal has inherent sanctity, then it needs to stand up. If it doesn't have inherent sanctity, but it's just Koche Bedakabayit, it's just its value is sanctified to the temple, then you don't need Hamada Baracha, and that would explain how you can redeem this animal. But then they say, wait a minute, Rabbi Shimon, you can't say this bright as Rabbi Shimon. because there's a different line in this braita that clearly doesn't go with Rabbi Shimon. Ema seifa, it says in the end of this braita, shchata al gabei ma'arachta ein la ptiya olamit. If you redeem it, once you already slaughtered it in its place, you can't, if you slaughtered it in its place, you can no longer redeem it. Now, we're going to prove right now this is not Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon actually thinks even at that stage you can redeem it, which is going to basically say we can't say this whole thing is Rabbi Shimon. So let's read. What does Rabbi Shimon say? V'hatanya, Rabbi Shimon omer, para mitama tumat ochalin, ho'il v'haitala shata kosher. Okay, there's two stages to this, so let's just bear with me before we see how we're going to prove Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, here we get into a different issue. We're learning a lot of other things today, which is tumat ochlin is only, right, something can become impure if it's food, if it's edible, okay, number one, but it also has to be able to be either eaten by a Jew, or a Jew can benefit from it and give it, let's say, to a Gentile to eat. Like, let's say there's something I can't eat, like basar b'chalav, okay? Something was cooked, milk and meat together, I can't eat it, but, right, I can give it to a Gentile. So now I'm confused. Can I? Is it asur b'hana'ah? Now I'm confused. But okay, my head is in too many places. But let's say there's something that I can give to a Gentile, no problem. Okay, but then it can be called food for the purposes of contracting impurity. But if I can't eat it and I can't benefit from it at all, like we're going to assume, okay, like a paraduma, once it's slaughtered, I can't benefit from it at all. So it shouldn't be b'tamei tumat ochlin. Okay, because it's asur b'hana'ah. So para mitama'at tumat ochlin, ho'il v'haitala shata kosher. Now, comes Rabbi Shimon and he says, listen, while it's true that after it's slaughtered, and then we use it for the paraduma, to make the ashes and all that, it's forbidden b'hana'ah. But there was a time after it was slaughtered that I could have redeemed it. I could have eaten it. How is so? Amar Rish Lakish, Omer Haya Rabbi Shimon. Rish Lakish explains. Rabbi Shimon would say the following: Para nifdet al gabei marachta. You can redeem it even after, if I slaughtered the animal in its place and did it all right, and then I find a nicer paraduma, I can swap them. I can redeem this paraduma. And just what I have to do, I have to give the money to the temple, but I can redeem it. So now he says, what do you see here? He says that after you slaughter on the marechet, you can redeem it, which means this braita can't be Rabbi Shimon, because remember what the braita said? Once you slaughter it, you can't redeem it forever. That's clearly not Rabbi Shimon. So we tried to say, right, it's bedek Abaye, and it's Rabbi Shimon, who says you don't need hamadav aracha for bedek Abaye, and that's how we explain that. But you can't say it's Rabbi Shimon because of that other line, which clearly doesn't match Rabbi Shimon. So basically, if we try to say, why could the paraduma be redeemed? Because it doesn't have inherent sanctity, that doesn't work. So in the end, we say the paraduma does have inherent sanctity, and it's a rare case. So now we have a problem, because if you want to say leib beti maneh alehem, and when is leib beti maneh alehem? In other words, why are you allowed to redeem this? Because basically the Torah, right, the rabbis stipulated from the beginning, we're separating this paraduma, but if we want to redeem it, we can't, right? If we find a better one, it was always stipulated from the beginning. So it does have inherent sanctity, but it can be redeemed. How would that apply? What did we just say? It doesn't apply in the case of the lost animal. Why not? Because lost animals are so uncommon. So how could the leib beti maneh alehem in such an uncommon case of a paraduma, not just the paraduma is uncommon, but the fact that we find a different animal or it would die or whatever would happen, so rare. To which the Gemara answers there's a different reason here. Elashane para ho'il v'dameha yikarim. Because para-adumas are so expensive. This is fascinating, right? The rabbis are always worried about people wasting money and not wanting people to have a big loss. Here it's a communal loss. If we basically have to just dump paraduma, right? Like the paraduma died and we're stuck, there's nothing we could do about it. That would be a huge financial loss for the community. The rabbi said, fine, we're going to allow it in this case. So we now explained our basically the second, right? The first whole, again, I want to remind you the way our sugya worked. The first whole section was Rav Chisda coming to say what happened to the sanctity, to which Raba answered, oh, look at the Torah. We could do it with the Torah. There they had a whole debate. Is it Kedushat Dam? Is it Kedushat Guf? And Raba kind of is able to prove his point. It's Kedushat Guf, and yet we can redeem it. But that didn't answer the basic question, which is, what happened to the sanctity, though? How could we just redeem it? And the answer in the second part of the sugya is le beitim matnan. Raba comes and explains, this is all stipulated from the beginning. If it's left over, we can use it it'll just be sanctified by its value, but not inherent sanctity. And then we said, well, how could you do that if you see you don't do it in the case of the par and seer of Yom Kippurim? That's because it's a rare case. So the rabbis made these stipulations for common things like leaving over extra, like having extras left over from the beginning of the year in the Ktoret, in the animals, and for cases where there's a huge financial loss, like the paraduma. Okay, thus ends our section, almost, not exactly, but now we're going to go off on a tangent for a minute, because if you noticed, we still haven't gotten to the main reason why we're here, which is what does it have to do with our Mishnah? So we'll get there very soon. Before we do that, we're going to have one side point about this Breita that we just saw about the paraduma. Amar Mar. Amar Mar is always right. We're quoting something we just quoted and going in depth for a minute. Meta tipadef. The paraduma dies, you can redeem it. V'chi podim et hakodashim lachilan leklavim. Wait a minute. There's a rule, which is an interesting rule. We only allow you to redeem things if you can do something with them, okay? And something of value. Like you can redeem meat in a certain, right? Like let's say sanctified meat or something, I don't know, something. You can redeem it so you can eat it, or you can redeem it so you can use it. But what's the paraduma going to be able to be used for? Just to throw it to the dogs. You can't really benefit from it much more than that. You can't benefit from its meat other than throwing it to the dogs. So, right, it's a nevela, right? Remember nevela, you can throw it to the dogs. So what are you going to do with it, right? Because it died. So, you can't redeem sanctified items just to give them to the dogs. It's because you can use the hide, okay? So while it's in a vela and it's a dead animal and you can't, right? Dead animals, you can actually use their hides. So remember, it wasn't slaughtered. That was the whole idea. It died on its own. Because it died, it's in a vela. Because it's in a vela, you can only give it to the dogs. But it has value, right? Giving it to the dogs is not enough value, but its hide has value. Wait a minute. So now you're saying, we said this paraduma has so much value, and that's why we're allowing you to redeem it. How much value is there in the hide? What that we're gonna let? You think the baiting got up and said, "Listen, if something happens to paraduma and we just use it for the hide, we're gonna allow this?" I'm Rav Kahana. I'm Reinashe migam launa. Well, it's like people say on the street. Rav Kahana says the camel for its ear is worth something, and even the ear of a camel is worth something. And of course, yes, the hide of a paraduma has value, and the baiting will even make a stipulation based on that. Oh, that was a side point. Now we're back to our main point, and we finally are going to understand why this is brought in our section. So now we're going to have another difficulty on Raba. Remember, Raba who says that basically this deen of Rabbi Yochanan, that you can redeem these kodashim, the extra animals, when they're tamimim, when they're unblemished. Etibe. Amru lo li Rabbi Shimon. If you remember in our Mishnah, they said to Rabbi Shimon the following: Ma'u sheyikrevu ze bazeh. If you have these Seirei Rosh Chodeshim, Seirei Regalim, remember Rabbi Shimon? Each one has its own independent purpose. There's no overlap. So they said to him, if one gets designated, like our case before, and it gets lost, and it's designated, let's say, for the holiday, and it gets lost, and then you find it, but you've already brought a different animal in its stead, then you have this animal left over. Can you use it on Rosh Chodesh, on the upcoming Rosh Chodesh? So what did Rabbi Shimon say? Amar lehem yikrevu. He said, sure you can. Amru lo ho'il ve'en kavartan shava he'achem krivim. They said to him, but wait, you don't think they work for the same things. So if each has a different purpose, Rosh Chodesh is for Tahor Shachal Tatameh, and Regalim are for Yudnev Yidiyah, not B'tchila, not B'sel. They're different. Amar lahem. So he answers them a pretty weak answer, which is they're all the same general category. They all have to do with some sort of impurity having to do with the temple and sanctified items, which is a bit of a weak answer. Mar says, if Raba, you're right, they had a much better answer. V'amai, lema lev beiti manalehem. Why wouldn't he just say, the court stipulated in the beginning that, okay, these are communal offerings. The court stipulated in the beginning, if you don't need them for this, use them for that. Now already you could say this is much more common. We have, all the holidays, every Rosh Chodesh, and then the Seir outside on Yom Kippur, right? All those can be interchangeable because the court stipulated from the beginning, if you don't end up needing them, right, you can use them for something else. So what's the answer? And this is going to lead into the whole next sugya, which we'll see tomorrow. Well, Rabbi Shimon Kamart, your whole question, Rabbi says you're asking me, is on Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah, right? It was a question, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon's answer. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold by this thing that I explained. My thing that I explained based on Rabbi Yochanan was based on the rabbi's opinion who disagree with Rabbi Shimon on exactly this issue. Okay, so now, how do we know this? To Amar of Idi bar Avid, Amar of Amram, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Tmidim shelo utzruchu litzibur. Okay, here's Rabbi Yochanan being quoted. Tmidim that we don't need anymore, right? Because they're leftover. L'divrei Rabbi Shimon ein nifdim tmimim. L'divrei chachamim nifdim tmimim. So don't ask me a question. This is the whole reason we brought this figure here. Don't ask a question on me from the Mishnah of Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon doesn't agree with this whole halacha. We hold like chachamim, like the mainstream opinion. Shimon has a unique opinion and doesn't fit in here. To which the Gemara now leads into a whole thing, which is Rabbanan de Pliga le Rabbi Shimon man minhu. Where are the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon? Like who? Rabbi Yochanan said this is machloket. Now we're going to go on a search for where do we see that the rabbis and Rabbi Yochanan, the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon disagree on exactly this issue, and that's going to be our next section, trying to find this machloket between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis. Do we hold the court stipulates from the beginning of the year, or do we not hold that principle? Okay, so what we did today really was one main topic, Rabbi Yochanan's statement. Raba, who quoted it, Rav Chisda started questioning it, then later Abaye questioned Raba. We have a slew of questions on Raba, right? Which is really one question, which is, how can you redeem sanctity from something that's kedushat haguf, right? It's very surprising to everybody. So we have basically 3 lines of questioning. One was, where he goes into the Ketoret as his proof, and then basically Rav Chisda says Ketoret kedushat damim, that doesn't prove anything, but Raba succeeds in kind of answering. Then we went into the problem, but how do you get rid of inherent sanctity? To which Rabbi answered, Le beitim lehem. And then we had a whole question from there, right? Is that really true? Does Le beitim lehem? What about the case where things are lost? And then we say, oh, that's unique. But if things are unique and they didn't make up for stipulation, what about the paraduma? Why can you do it there? No, that's because it's expensive, right? And therefore, so Le beitim lehem when it's expected or when it's a big loss. And then we had to talk about the big loss a little. Was it such a big loss? And then we got back to this Leib Beit Din and questioned that from Abaye, questioned it from our Mishnah. Doesn't sound like Leib Beit Din. I said, oh, don't worry about our Mishnah. That's Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold by this whole thing. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.